This episode of LegalEagle was made possible by Skillshare. Learn to think like a lawyer for free for 2 months by clicking the link in the description. Okay, I'll admit it, I was pleasantly surprised by The Witcher. Interesting characters, compelling narratives, and new takes on an old genre. But then I got to this part.
Lioness of Sintra, that I come to claim what is rightfully mine. Pavetta, by the law of surprise.
Oh, cool. The law of surprise. That thing. Wait, the what now? And then a number of thoughts went through my head. Okay, Devin, you went to law school. This is clearly a law. This is a thing. You know this. Think, Devin. Law school. Contracts, offer, acceptance, law of surprise. Think. You don't want Thomas Frank to make fun of you again. Wait, there's no such thing as the law of surprise. Is there? It was an emotional couple of moments. Hey Legal Eagles, it's time to think like a lawyer because I'm trying to figure out The Witcher. And if I have to do it, then by God, I'm taking you with me. The Witcher is the newest entree into the fantasy genre, an 8-episode series on Netflix for those who are still going through Game of Thrones withdrawal. The show is based on a set of short stories published by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, and also gave rise to the famous Witcher video games as well. The main plot centers around a few main characters: the central protagonist Geralt of Rivia, the eponymous Witcher, the mage Yennefer of Vengerberg, and Princess Ciri. Their lives are intertwined for a variety of reasons, most of which are tied to the vague concept of destiny.
Destiny has determined the surprise be Pavetta.
If you're unfamiliar with the books, then the show itself can be a little bit confusing based on the different roles between the Witcher, elves, mages, and there's a lot to absorb and understand, but possibly none are more confusing and controversial than The Witcher's Law of Surprise. The Law of Surprise is introduced in episode 4 of The Witcher when, during a soiree, also they refer to this party as a soiree many times, and this French neologism seems way out of place. At any rate, during this soiree, the point is to find a suitor for Queen Calanthe's daughter, Pavetta. And during the course of these suitors trying to woo Pavetta, a helmeted man, Duny, comes in claiming that the queen's daughter is actually owed to him due to his right under the law of surprise.
I am Lord Urchion of Erlenwald, and I have come to claim your daughter's hand in marriage.
He claims to have earned this right by saving the life of the queen's late husband, King Ragnar.
My whole life a living misery until the day that I saved your husband, King Ragnar, from a certain death. By tradition, I chose the law of surprise as payment.
Duny, or the Knight of Urchion, demands his payment in the form of Pavetta's hand in marriage.
Duny!
But don't worry, this isn't rapey because they conveniently already met and fell in love off-screen. In Canada, probably. So Pavetta is what lawyers would call his chattel property.
Until destiny intervened, and our hearts collided.
But also, girl power, I guess. So despite the Me Too issues with the law of surprise, on its face, the law is relatively straightforward. For payment of a great deed, usually saving someone's life, one can claim something which the debtor does not yet possess at the moment the law is claimed. It's a surprise for the giver and the receiver. The tricky part is there appears to be 2 possible outcomes. For the one invoking the law of surprise, they will receive either the first thing that comes to greet the indebted when they return home after their life is being saved, or what you find at home and you don't expect. Geralt is apparently super cool with this arranged marriage / indentured servitude, and when given the chance to repay Duny for saving his life, he claims the same right regarding Pavetta, and thus the circle of slavery continues with Pavetta's child Ciri being contracted to Geralt.
People linked by destiny will always find each other.
Feminism. So those are the terms of the law of surprise, but is it legal? Let's take a look at the legal enforceability of the law of surprise as if it were applied today in the usually non-fantasy world that we live in. Now, right off the bat, we can see that there is a huge problem when dealing with any law that allows one to acquire another person as a designated method of payment. As you probably know, the 13th Amendment states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any subject to their jurisdiction. So considering in both instances that we see on screen in The Witcher, the law of surprise is invoked to claim the daughter of one who was saved, it appears that this would clearly be a violation of the 13th Amendment against involuntary servitude. Now, sure, Pavetta seemed perfectly content with being given over to Duny since they had already fallen in love, conveniently, but I've got to imagine that that's more of the exception rather than the rule. Clearly, The Witcher has no problem with involuntary servitude.
The promise made must be honored.
But Bill of Rights, schmill of rights. Let's think beyond the Constitution. What if we assume that the law of surprise resulted in the transfer of something other than humans? Maybe a new puppy, a pup, as Iced refers to it, or a new car that your significant other bought for you while you were away. Would the law of surprise be legal then? Well, to answer this question, it would require a foray into the complicated world of contract law. And just as the delightful Yaskier says,
respect doesn't make history.
well, contract law probably doesn't make for great fantasy fiction, but let's take a look and see how we might make a workable law of surprise in real life. Now, by way of background, contract law, unlike some other areas of law, like criminal law, is not merely codified into a bunch of neatly packaged statutes. Contract law is primarily developed from the common law.
'Tis no swindle. Asking for payment with the law of surprise is as old as mankind itself.
Generally, contract law is a blend of state case law that's developed by judges and statutes that are passed by state legislatures. So first things first, how is a contract formed? Well, in order for there to be a contract, there are certain requirements or elements that have to be met. And while it varies a little bit from state to state, generally those are an offer, an acceptance of that offer, consideration between the parties, mutuality of obligation, competency and capacity, and in certain circumstances, though certainly not all or even most circumstances, a written instrument, a written contract. So let's begin with the offer. An offer for purposes of contract law is a promise to do or refrain from doing something specific in the future. An offer can be as simple as Party A offers to mow Party B's lawn next Tuesday. So in the case of The Witcher, right off the bat, it's hard to see how the law of surprise even meets the first element of contract formation in that it doesn't contain a valid offer. It's more like a gratuitous gift. Essentially, half of the exchange is already accomplished. For example, King Ragnanor's life is already saved by Duny, so that there's no reason for a contract to be formed in order for payment because nothing was offered in the first place. Now, on the other hand, just because the parties don't expressly exchange words, it's still possible that based on their actions, something known as an implied in fact contract has occurred. An implied in fact contract is an obligation arising from a mutual agreement and intent to promise, where the agreement and the promise haven't actually been expressed in words. Now, regardless of the means of expressing the contract, an implied in fact contract still requires an unambiguous offer, acceptance, and mutual intent to be bound, and of course, consideration. But here we run into the same problems. The deed has already been done. The life has been saved under circumstances that don't give rise to a contract or an implied contract, so we still have the same problems. But for the sake of argument, let's consider the fact that we're calling this the law of surprise. So in this fictional scenario, the law of surprise was passed by a governing body and codified into a statute, and thus no offer or acceptance is required. Merely a life being saved requires payment in return. So for the sake of argument, let's assume that the, legislature or parliament of Sintra has passed this law of surprise, and it doesn't require offer or acceptance in terms of these circumstances where you save a life. Let's move on to the third element that's required for a contract to be formed, and that's consideration. And consideration is generally described as promising something of value in exchange for a specified action or non-action of another person. Essentially, value for value. So if you agree to give a gift to someone, that's not a contract because you have gratuitously offered something to them and received no consideration back for your promise. And if that's the case, that might actually work. You obviously have performed something of great value. You saved someone's life, and that is extremely valuable to the person whose life was saved. And in return, you are being promised this other thing. You don't know what it is, but it might be something of great value. And the law allows for you to contract for something as valueless as they call it a peppercorn. Yes, it's a very, very low value, but its value nonetheless, and you are allowed to contract based on that mutual exchange. So this law of surprise actually kind of works in terms of consideration, but that raises another problem, which is that often a defense to a contract is vagueness or ambiguity. And here's where things really start to get dicey. Courts require what's called a meeting of the minds to form a contract. And that means that the parties agree to what the terms of the contract are. And if we look back at the law of surprise, we see that the thing that is being promised is either the first thing that comes to greet the debtor when they return home after their life is being saved, or what they find at home and didn't expect. So in a word, that sounds ambiguous. Now, on the other hand, every contract involves some risk. Let's say you formed a contract with a farmer to buy their entire crop for the year. You might get a huge bumper crop, or you might get nothing because the crop was wiped out because of a drought. So there's always an inherent risk and some ambiguity in terms of performance. But this also seems like you have no idea what you're contracting for in the first place. On top of that, there's overall ambiguity as to how this contract would be enforced. Even the specific words used in the law of surprise, like greet, or the time frame that we're talking about here, could be open to multiple interpretations. What does it mean to be greeted with something when you get home? What if the first thing that happens is your dog runs out and licks you in the face? What if your spouse is angry with you and starts yelling at you? What if there are multiple things that are new that you didn't expect when you got home? What if there are twins? Do you owe both of them or just one? The options and interpretations are endless. I feel like at the very least, everyone in this fictional world of The Witcher needs a good lawyer to talk about all of these different eventualities. And then of course we run into huge performance issues. In contract law, generally your damages are measured in money. Sometimes you're entitled to what's called specific performance, or in other words, compelling one party to turn over the other. For example, that happens a lot in real estate, where a piece of real estate is considered so unique that money damages are not enough to compensate someone for the loss of that property that was supposed to be turned over. And if we are talking about money damages for a person that was promised and doesn't want to go through with the indentured servitude, how are we supposed to value that person's life? In daylights, in sunsets, in midnights, or cups of coffee? Basically impossible to put a value on that person. And there's at least one other contract offense that would probably bar a law of surprise contract from being formed, which is called the Statute of Frauds. Now, I mentioned earlier that most contracts actually don't need to be written. That is a common misconception. You can have an oral contract as long as you meet the other requirements for contract formation. But the law requires that certain contracts do in fact be written down. The idea is that certain contracts are so important that to prevent fraud, we need to require a written document. Now, the types of contracts to which this defense applies are contracts often that involve the sale or transfer of land, contracts that cannot be completed within 1 year, and those made in connection with marriage. And two of those scenarios could be argued by a defendant in challenging the enforceability of the law of surprise. Certainly the example of Duny and Pavetta highlights both of these contract types. Duny didn't claim the law of surprise for Pavetta until 15 years after the contract was made.
I knew no woman would ever accept me like this. And so I waited. I waited until the 12th bell when the curse breaks.
And on top of that, Duny is claiming that his contract entitles him to marry Pavetta based on the law of surprise, and thus we have a legitimate defense that under the Statute of Frauds that this contract was required to be in writing, and it wasn't. Now, is there any way that we could revise this law of surprise in order to make a legally binding contract? Well, I think so, but there are a couple of things that we need to address. First, we have the ambiguity problem. So we need to get rid of this, you're entitled to whatever it is that the debtor finds upon returning home. Instead of saying it's whatever they find, at the time of contract formation, you say, I want, in return for saving your life, this specific thing, your new car, your horse, your newborn pup. By specifying the things that you are entitled to, you remove a lot of the ambiguity. On top of that, in order to solve the problem of offer and acceptance, instead of claiming the law of surprise after you save someone's life, you might want to say before you save their life, yes, I will in fact save your life, but only if you promise me X, Y, or Z. By proactively doing it in a sort of underhanded way, they are promising to give you that thing in return for your consideration of saving their life. Obviously something of great value. And of course, leave the women out of it. You can't contract for people. Now, of course, this kind of takes the surprise out of the law of surprise, but I mean, I don't know what you want from me. No one ever spoke to their lawyer and was like, I love talking to my lawyer. They let me do whatever I want. So yeah, the law of surprise, as it's portrayed in The Witcher, has more legal holes in it than Swiss cheese. Certainly if someone brought a breach of contract case based on the law of surprise, the court would strike down that contract as invalid on any number of grounds, but based on some minor adjustments, the law of surprise might give rise to a valid contract. But if we've learned anything from The Witcher, it's that we should appreciate those who roam the land looking to right wrongs and do justice. And I think you know who I'm talking about. So, if you could, please, toss a coin to your lawyer, oh website of plenty, oh website of plenty. Toss a coin to your lawyer, a friend of legality. Now, I bet you didn't think I played guitar, and you're kind of right, because I barely play guitar. I've been meaning to brush up on my skills, and I've been meaning to take Mike Boyd's Skillshare class, Guitar Fundamentals, Learn Quick with Mike Boyd. In this class, Mike walks you through the basics of learning to play guitar, starting with the guitar anatomy, leading all the way up to playing your first 2 songs. Even if you've never played a guitar in your life, Mike Boyd will show you what you need to know. Or if you want to learn another skill, check out Mike's other Skillshare course, How to Learn, Strategies for Starting, Practicing, and Mastering the Skills You've Always Wanted, which helps anyone learn something new, reduce their likelihood of quitting a new challenge, or get good at something faster. Skillshare is an online learning community that has tens of thousands of classes on everything, like music, design, technology, and business. It's great for anyone who wants to learn guitar or basically any other skill that you can think of. A yearly membership is less than $10 per month, but the first 500 Legal Eagles will get 2 free months of Skillshare when you click on the link below. Plus, clicking on the link really helps out the channel. So just click the link in the description. A free membership gives you unlimited access to must-know topics so you can improve your skills and learn new things. All free for 2 months.
Your skills will be rewarded.
So, do you agree with my analysis? Leave your objections in the comments, and check out this playlist over here with all of my other legal reactions, including my take on South Park and The Simpsons, and I promise it features none of my singing or guitar playing. And as always, I'll see you in court.